A 4-year-old knocked on the CEO's door and said, "Can you be my friend?" That day, a miracle happened. Under the fading glow of a late autumn afternoon, the city's wealthiest boulevard was beginning to sparkle. Storefronts draped in golden fairy lights cast warm glows onto the polished sidewalks. Cars rolled by slowly, their windows tinted, their drivers distracted. The air held the promise of oncoming winter, crisp, cool, and quiet. Mason Reed sat alone on the front steps of his mansion, a sleek architectural marvel set back from the street by tall hedges and a black iron gate. His sleeves were rolled up, his collar unbuttoned, but his posture was sharp, shoulders drawn with invisible tension. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the street, beyond the city. It was the look of a man who hadn't spoken to someone from the heart in far too long. Across the road, a woman in her early 30s pushed a worn, squeaky cart filled with empty bottles and discarded cans. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her jeans faded, her coat clearly not enough for the biting wind. One hand gripped the cart's handle, the other held tightly to a child's. Lucas was 4, his small hand buried in his mother's, his other hand clutching a crumpled plastic bottle that he squeezed rhythmically as he walked. He wore a pilled navy sweater, too short at the sleeves, and one shoe that had clearly been repaired with duct tape. But his eyes, bright, curious, unfiltered, took in the glowing street with awe, not envy. They were passing Mason's house when Lucas suddenly stopped. He stared at the man sitting so still, so silent, alone on his steps. Mason, in his pressed slacks and leather shoes, seemed like a statue, perfect and cold. But Lucas saw something else, something lonely. Without warning, Lucas let go of his mother's hand and crossed the narrow street. "Lucas!" his mother, Laura, hissed, her voice tight with panic. She started after him, heart racing. Lucas stopped a few feet from Mason, looked up and said clearly, his small voice high and certain, "Can you be my friend, mister?" Mason blinked. He looked down, startled. A child. Not a beggar, not a fundraiser, not paparazzi, just a child, with big eyes and a hopeful stare. Laura arrived seconds later, breathless, and reached for her son's hand. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, eyes not meeting Mason's. "Hamill didn't mean to bother you. He talks to people sometimes." "I keep telling him not to." Mason raised a hand, gently. "He's not bothering me." His voice was rough from disuse, but steady. Lucas kept looking up at him. "You looked sad," he said, matter of fact. "I thought maybe you needed a friend, too." Something cracked, not visibly, not loudly, but Mason felt it, deep, somewhere inside his chest. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself level with the boy. "A friend, huh?" he said, trying to smile. Lucas nodded seriously. "Friends don't let people sit alone too long. That's what Mommy says." Mason's gaze flicked alone too long and looked ugly. "I didn't know I looked that sad," Mason murmured. "You do," Lucas said. "But it's okay. You can sit with us if you want. We share stuff." Laura tugged at her son's hand again. "Lucas, come on." But Mason held up a hand again, gentler this time, to both of them. "Wait," he said, then looked to Laura. "Would you both like a cookie?" Laura blinked. "A cookie?" "I bake too many," he said, voice lighter than before. "And I don't like eating alone." Lucas's face lit up. "I love cookies." Laura hesitated, clearly unsure. "Just for a minute," Mason added. Lucas looked up at her with that pleading sparkle only a 4-year-old could master. After a long pause, she nodded. And as Mason opened the front door, holding it for the small boy and his cautious mother, he felt something stir for the first time in a long while. It wasn't big, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And it started with one question. The kitchen was immaculate, sleek granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, under-cabinet lighting casting a soft golden hue. It looked like something from a high-end catalog, perfect in every detail, but there was no warmth, no magnets on the fridge, no mug out of place, no crumbs on the floor. It was a kitchen built to be admired, not lived in. Mason led them in quietly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the moment might shatter. Lucas's eyes lit up at the sight of the cookie jar on the counter. Mason unscrewed the lid and offered him a selection. The boy climbed eagerly into a bar stool, his small hands reaching for a chocolate chip cookie as big as his palm. He bit into it and let out a happy sigh, crumbs dotting the edge of his mouth. Laura remained standing near the door, hesitant. Her eyes swept the room, not to admire it, but to understand its owner. She looked down at her coat, tugged it tighter, as if trying to make herself smaller. "You can sit if you'd like," Mason said gently, gesturing to the stool beside Lucas. Laura gave a tight smile, but remained where she was. Mason turned to pour a glass of milk and placed it in front of Lucas. The boy's legs swung back and forth as he dipped his cookie carefully. He was completely at ease, as though this marble-topped island had always been his snack spot. Laura finally stepped forward, not to eat, but to tend to her son. She pulled a crumpled napkin from her coat pocket, gently wiped Lucas's hands, then placed another napkin under the cookie to catch crumbs. The motion was practiced, motherly, and achingly tender. Mason watched her, not in judgment, not in pity, in something closer to awe. He had hosted CEOs, investors, politicians in this kitchen. Not one of them had ever moved with that kind of quiet grace. "Do you like cookies too?" Mason asked, his tone light. Laura glanced at him. "They smell great, but we're okay, thank you." He didn't press. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching Lucas hum softly between bites, blissfully unaware of the adult hesitation hanging in the air. "Do you live nearby?" Mason asked. Laura's eyes flickered. "Not exactly. We move around." He nodded, not asking more. She appreciated that. Lucas finished his cookie and looked up with bright eyes. "Mr. Friend?" Mason raised an eyebrow, hiding a smile. "Yes, sir? Can we come again? Maybe tomorrow?" Laura inhaled sharply, already shaking her head. "Lucas," but Mason spoke first. "Maybe tomorrow," he said, surprising even himself. Lucas beamed. Laura looked at Mason, searching his face for any trace of sarcasm or pity or obligation. She found none, just a quiet, steady presence. She stood up, brushing crumbs from Lucas's sweater. "Thank you. For this, we should go." "I'll walk you out," Mason offered, as they stepped back into the chilly air. The sky had deepened into dusk. Laura took Lucas's hand again, her fingers curling instinctively around his small one. "Same time tomorrow?" Lucas asked, hopeful. Mason looked at him, then at Laura. "If your mom's okay with it?" "Yes." She hesitated, then nodded once. And just like that, the door closed softly behind them. But the air inside felt just a little warmer than before. In the days that followed, they returned. Not every day, and never for long, but enough that Mason began to expect the soft knock or the quiet crunch of tiny sneakers on the front walk just after sunset. Each time, Laura and Lucas entered with polite restraint. Lucas would race to the same stool, reaching eagerly for whatever cookie Mason had baked that day, oatmeal raisin, snickerdoodle, sometimes just plain shortbread. Laura would hover at first, then settle into the corner of the kitchen bench, never asking for anything, always ready to leave if Mason hinted even slightly. But he never did. Instead, he found himself asking questions he hadn't asked in years. How Lucas liked his cookies, whether Laura preferred tea or coffee. He began stocking milk she never requested, making sure the cookies weren't too sweet. Lucas once mentioned cavities. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. After they left, Mason trailed them from a distance, keeping to the shadows of trees and lampposts. He watched Laura pick through a recycling bin, extracting bottles and flattening them methodically. She thanked the shopkeeper who allowed her to rinse out a few containers in the alley sink. She gave a man on the street the last half of a sandwich she'd saved. Lucas trailed beside her, always watching, always listening. When people looked at him, he smiled and bowed slightly, a gesture taught, clearly repeated often. Mason returned home that evening and stood in his kitchen for a long time, staring at the 2 empty mugs on the counter. The next day, as Lucas stirred his milk with a cinnamon stick Mason had jokingly called a magic wand, Mason turned to Laura. "Can I ask, what did you do before all this?" Laura paused. "Before? Before life got this hard." She considered for a moment, then said simply, "I was a chef, head of the kitchen at Loon." Mason blinked. "Loon? As in the Loon that got 2 stars from Taste and Table magazine?" She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Back when it was still under private ownership." "That was you?" Mason looked genuinely stunned. "I designed the seasonal menus, trained the staff, sourced everything from local farms." She smiled faintly. "We were doing 120 covers a night at one point." "What happened?" Laura's expression softened, tinged with something darker. "I married the wrong man, trusted too much. He convinced me to sign over some financial paperwork. Turned out I was liable for his debts. He vanished. The restaurant sold. I lost everything in 6 weeks." Mason didn't speak. She continued. "I tried waitressing at a smaller place, but word gets around fast. People don't like hiring someone who used to run the show. They think you'll be a threat, or worse, that you're cursed." She looked over at Lucas. "I was 2 months behind on rent. Then it was gone." She said it plainly, without drama, just fact. But it hit Mason harder than if she'd cried. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Laura smiled gently. "Don't be. I still have him." She touched Lucas's shoulder. "That means I didn't lose everything." Mason studied her then, really studied her. Not the worn coat or tired eyes, but the way she sat tall, the careful way she wrapped her son's scarf when he wasn't looking, the pride that never wavered even in silence. He no longer saw her as a woman seeking shelter. He saw her as a woman who had once commanded a bustling kitchen, built something from nothing, and survived the collapse of it all with grace. And he began to wonder, not what he could give her, but what he could learn from her. The first time Mason asked Laura to help him cook, she hesitated. They had just finished another quiet afternoon. Lucas licking the last crumbs off his fingers, Laura dabbing at his face with a napkin, and Mason stood by the stove, staring into a pot of water like it might speak to him. He glanced at Laura and asked, almost too casually, "Would you help me cook something?" Laura looked up. "Cook? You used to run a kitchen," he said. "I can barely boil pasta." Lucas deserves something better. Laura hesitated, then nodded. "I can show you how to make something simple, something warm." So it began. Twice a week Laura came early. While Lucas played with wooden spoons and stacked measuring cups like building blocks, Mason and Laura stood side by side in the kitchen. She taught him how to build flavor without expensive ingredients, how a few onions, garlic, carrots, and celery could become the base of something beautiful. She showed him how to stretch $1 into a pot of soup that could feed a dozen. "This," she said, stirring a simmering pot, "used to be our Thursday special. The guys in construction boots came in just for this." Mason leaned in, breathing the steam. "Smells like winter." "Smells like survival," she replied, but there was a smile in her voice. The soup became a ritual. Laura chopped with practiced grace, Mason learning the rhythm of her movements. He began to enjoy it, the repetition, the scent of browning onions, the way her voice softened when she explained why certain vegetables were added at certain stages. Lucas loved it most of all. He sat at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and drew the same scene over and over. 3 figures at a table, bowls in front of them, a dog in the corner. They didn't have a dog, but Lucas wanted one. One evening, he handed the drawing to Mason. "That's you? That's Mommy? That's me. We're eating soup." Mason stared at the paper. The figures were messy, but the smiles were unmistakable. He pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sun. Their dinners weren't fancy, but they were full. Lucas giggling over silly stories, Laura laughing at Mason's confusion over spice names, Mason watching both of them like they were slowly pulling color back into the grayscale world he'd been living in. One night, as they sat down to eat, a rustic vegetable stew with herbs Mason had tried growing on his windowsill, he turned to Laura and asked, "Did you always love cooking?" Laura stirred her bowl. "Not at first. It was just work. Fast-paced, loud, competitive. But after a while, yes. I started seeing it differently." "How so?" She looked at him, and in the glow of the pendant light, her eyes seemed softer, because cooking for someone else, especially when they're hungry, is more than feeding them. It's saying, "I see you. I care if you're okay." Mason didn't respond right away. The air felt heavy in a meaningful way. Laura set her spoon down. "When I lost my job and the house and everything, I stopped cooking. It felt pointless. But then Lucas would look at me with those eyes, and I'd boil some rice, saute a few vegetables, anything, just to prove to myself I still could, that I still had something to give." She paused, glanced down at her bowl, then whispered, "Cooking for someone else, that's how I know I'm still alive." Mason's chest tightened. He looked across the table at her, and for the first time, truly saw not just the woman sitting in front of him, but the fight it took for her to be there. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. But deep in his chest something stirred. Something he had thought long buried, long frozen, was beginning to thaw. Mason had never considered the small things before. How towels were folded, how mugs were aligned on the counter, how silence after dinner could still feel full. But since Laura and Lucas had started coming around regularly, the quiet wasn't the same. It was warmer somehow, softer. One afternoon, as Mason came down the stairs from a late meeting call, he stopped mid-step. On the banister rested a neatly folded shirt, his favorite white button-up. Days earlier, he had spilled soup on it during one of their cooking lessons and left it forgotten in the laundry room. Now it was perfectly pressed, spotless, and resting as if it belonged nowhere else. He picked it up gently. There was no note, no mention, just a small, silent kindness. The next day, he noticed the kitchen sink gleamed. Not just rinsed, but scrubbed. The towel hanging from the oven handle had been refolded, just slightly more carefully than he would have done it. A lemon sat sliced on the edge of the cutting board, likely used to scrub out the metal pans. He never saw her do it. Never heard her say anything. But Laura had been tending to the spaces around her, the same way she tended to people, with quiet, deliberate care. That evening, over a bowl of soup Lucas called the best dinner in the universe, Mason leaned against the counter and asked casually, "Have you ever thought about opening your own place?" Laura looked up from slicing bread. "A restaurant?" "Something smaller, maybe, like a food cart." She laughed lightly. "With what money? And where would I even start?" "You'd start," Mason said, "by telling me what you'd serve." Laura set the knife down. "Honestly, I've dreamed about a cart that serves real food for real people. Workers who don't want another greasy burger or overpriced salad. Just something clean, filling, made with care." She wiped her hands on a towel. "A hot meal but affordable, like soup with lentils and rice, sandwiches with fresh vegetables, coffee that doesn't taste like it's been reheated 4 times. Mason smiled. "That sounds exactly like what this city needs." Laura tilted her head, skeptical. "You're humoring me." "I'm not," he said. "You're a chef, a real one. Not someone who dabbles, not someone who got lucky. You know how to create something from nothing. That's rare." She stared at him, caught off guard. "I could help you with a plan," he added. "We could start small, test recipes, find a location. I have contacts with city permits, and I know someone who restores food carts." Laura frowned. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Mason said simply, "I don't invest in charity. I invest in people I believe in." She looked at him, truly looked, searching for the catch. "I'm not offering out of pity," he added. "I'm offering because I see how hard you work, how seriously you take every detail, and because I think the city would be lucky to have your cooking again." Her lips parted, but no words came. Mason stepped closer. You don't have to decide now, just think about it. And for the rest of the evening, though neither of them said another word about it, something changed in the room. Laura smiled more softly. Mason poured her tea without asking, and in the silence that settled between them, Mason realized it was no longer silence at all. It was understanding. It was nearly midnight when Laura noticed the light in the backyard still glowing. She had just finished rinsing the last dish, drying her hands on a faded towel, while the kitchen settled into stillness. Lucas was curled up in the armchair, bundled in a soft gray blanket Mason had once draped over the couch for guests but rarely used. His tiny form rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep. His cheeks flushed from a long day of playing and laughing. Mason had gone outside hours earlier, saying softly that he just needed some air. Laura assumed he'd be back in a few minutes, but minutes passed into an hour, then more. The clock ticked, the dishwasher hummed, and something in the air began to shift. It wasn't loud or obvious, just a strange tension, a stillness that settled too deep. She glanced toward the back windows and saw the string lights still glowing above the yard, casting soft circles on the wooden planks below. The swing swayed slightly in the breeze, but Mason wasn't on it. Her chest tightened. Without a word, she slipped on her shoes and stepped outside. The wind had turned. It was sharper now, cutting through her sweater as she crossed the deck. The trees rustled above her, whispering secrets into the darkness. Then she saw him. Mason was slumped near the base of the bench beneath the hanging bulbs. His shoulders drooped at an unnatural angle, head tilted, one arm hanging lifelessly beside him. The sight stopped her heart cold. "Mason?" she called, urgency rising. No answer. She rushed forward, dropped to her knees and reached for him. "Mason!" Still nothing. Laura's instincts, deep, motherly, sharp, took over. Her hands shook, but her movements were purposeful. She checked his pulse, found it, weak but present. His skin was cold to the touch and his breath shallow. She whispered his name again and again, gently tilting his face toward hers, brushing damp hair away from his forehead. After what felt like forever, his eyelids fluttered. "Hey," she whispered, exhaling shakily, her relief near tears. "You passed out, but it's okay. I've got you." He murmured something she couldn't understand, just breath and sound. Still, she looped his arm over her shoulder, bracing his weight with her small frame. He was heavier than she expected, not just in body, but in burden. It took all her strength to walk him back inside. The house was quiet again, almost too quiet. She eased him down onto the couch, adjusting the pillows, pulling a thick blanket over him with careful hands. Then she sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged, her back against the couch, her eyes never leaving his face. His breathing was steady now, his brow less creased, but his body still trembled faintly, worn down by something deeper than exhaustion. Outside, the wind howled low. Time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Sometime before dawn, small footsteps echoed across the hardwood. Lucas emerged from the hallway, dragging his eyes, dragging his blanket like a cape behind him. He blinked into the dim room and froze when he saw his mother on the floor, holding Mason's hand. "Mommy!" he whispered, voice groggy. Laura turned, gently pressing a finger to her lips. "Shh, Mason needs rest." Lucas padded closer and stood beside her, peering over her shoulder at the sleeping man. "Is he sick?" he asked, concern lacing his words. Laura glanced back at Mason, his face pale against the pillow. "He's just tired, sweetheart. Very tired." Lucas was quiet for a while, longer than usual. Then came the question, "Mommy, are we his family now?" The words landed in the room like a drop of water into stillness, small but rippling into everything. Laura's breath caught. She looked up at her son, her mouth slightly parted, eyes suddenly full. She wasn't ready for that question, not yet, not here, but he had asked it, and the truth of it echoed in her chest. Before she could speak, she saw it. A tear, slow and silent, slipping from the corner of Mason's eye. He hadn't woken fully. But he had heard. Laura reached for a tissue, dabbed it away with the same tenderness she'd used 100 times on Lucas. She looked at Mason, really looked at him. Not the CEO, not the powerful man, but the person. The man who'd fed them, listened to them, shared his world with no demand in return. A man now asleep on the couch because somewhere along the way he forgot how to rest unless someone reminded him. She turned to her son and whispered, soft as the first light rising beyond the windows, "Maybe we are." The early morning sun filtered through the city haze as Laura adjusted her apron for the third time. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded against her ribs like a drumbeat. Today was the first day of something entirely new, something hers. The food cart gleamed under a fresh coat of soft sage-green paint. The name, Laura's Honest Spoon, was hand-painted in clean white letters, with Lucas's crayon-drawn spoon logo printed neatly on a laminated sign. Lucas had insisted on sticking labels on each soup container himself, his tongue poking out in concentration as he pressed them perfectly crooked. "Perfect," Laura said, smiling at his handiwork. Mason had done everything behind the scenes: permits, licenses, paperwork, even the sourcing of the restored cart itself. But he never took credit. When Laura tried to thank him, he simply said, "You're the chef. I'm just helping get the kitchen wheels rolling." The menu was simple: hearty vegetable stew, spiced lentil soup, thick slices of crusty bread, and a small dessert, oatmeal cookies, Lucas's favorite. By 11 a.m., a line had already begun to form. Construction workers, office assistants, curious foodies who had read whispers on neighborhood blogs. People murmured, "This is the place, the soup made by the chef who used to live on the street." Laura ladled her first bowl with careful hands. Mason stood nearby, his sleeves rolled up, wearing a crisp white shirt without a tie. He didn't speak, just watched, proudly, quietly. He had never looked so relaxed. As Laura served customers with practiced grace, Lucas stood beside her, handing out napkins and grinning like he owned the cart. Mason occasionally stepped in to carry extra soup pots or refill the water tank. It was messy, chaotic, real, but it felt like life. Around noon, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a tall woman in her early 60s, clad in a navy wool coat, her hair in a soft silver bob. Her heels clicked softly on the sidewalk. Evelyn Reed had arrived. Mason straightened slightly as she approached. "Mom," he said simply. Evelyn took in the food cart, her nose wrinkling faintly at the steam rising from the soup. Then her gaze shifted to Laura, who was bent over a tray of bread rolls, tucking them neatly into a basket. "This," she said coolly, "is the woman you've been inviting into your home?" Mason didn't flinch. "Yes." "She's running a soup cart?" "She's building something," he said, with more integrity than half the boardrooms I've ever been in. Evelyn gave no reply. Laura turned and saw them. She smiled, polite, warm, unbothered, and approached with a bowl. "Welcome," she said simply. "We're trying a ginger lentil today. Would you like to try it?" Evelyn arched a brow but took the bowl. She sat at a small folding table nearby, spoon poised, ready to dismiss, but after one bite she stilled. A second spoonful followed. "This ginger tastes like the dish my grandmother used to cook," she murmured, half to herself. Laura returned to the cart, not pressing for approval, not watching for reaction. Evelyn finished the soup in silence. She stood, brushed off her coat, and turned to Mason. "It's good," she said, then paused. "Surprisingly good." She didn't say more. No blessings, no declarations. But as she walked away, just before she reached the corner, Evelyn paused. She turned and looked back at the cart. Laura was crouched beside Lucas, laughing softly as he showed her something on his hand-drawn menu board. Her hair glowed gold in the midday sun, her posture relaxed, natural. Evelyn watched for a beat longer than necessary, then turned away. Her face didn't change, but her eyes had softened, and Mason, watching from the side, understood. She had seen what he saw, a woman not trying to take anything, but a woman who had already given so much. a woman who hadn't stepped into their family by ambition, but by love. Without a word, Evelyn gave her silent nod. And that was enough. The air smelled like cut grass and warm cinnamon as the September sun stretched lazily across the park. Families filled the picnic area, blankets spread wide, coolers popping open, children laughing in bursts like sparklers. It was the start of a new school year, and Lucas had just completed his first week of kindergarten. He ran ahead in his little blue backpack, chasing bubbles blown by a nearby toddler, while Laura and Mason followed with a woven basket and 2 cups of lemonade. Laura looked different now, stronger, brighter. Her hair was loosely pinned, catching the sunlight like spun gold. Her clothes fit better, though still simple. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that came not from comfort, but from rebuilding. Her food cart had grown in success over the past year. Laura's honest spoon had earned a local feature in a neighborhood magazine, and lines still wrapped around the corner at lunchtime. She had used the money to rent a modest but cozy apartment, just 4 blocks from Mason's home. Still independent, still hers. Mason had helped when she asked, but never more than she allowed. He had learned that about her, and in return she had given him something he never thought he'd have again: peace. They found a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree and spread out their blanket. Lucas soon returned, breathless and giggling, diving onto the grass beside them. "I'm hungry," he declared. "What's for dessert?" Mason chuckled and opened a basket. "I might have brought something special." He pulled out 3 perfectly frosted cupcakes, each in a paper wrapper, one with a tiny blue sugar star on top, Lucas's favorite. Lucas grabbed it instantly and took a giant bite, then paused. He frowned, chewing thoughtfully, then reached into his mouth and pulled something out. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a shiny object between 2 fingers. Laura leaned forward, eyes widening. It was a ring. Simple, elegant, a thin silver band with a tiny sapphire set in the center. No diamonds, no glitter, just clarity. Her gaze shot to Mason, who had already shifted onto one knee. He didn't speak right away. He waited until her eyes met his. "Will you let me stay?" he said softly. "With you two? Not out of guilt, not because I feel responsible, but because you made me remember what a home feels like." Laura blinked, tears instantly rising. She covered her mouth with one hand. Lucas, still holding the cupcake, gasped. "Say yes, Mommy. He's already part of our picture." Mason reached out and took Laura's hand, steady and sure. "I don't need a ceremony or a title. I just want to belong where I already feel at home." Laura laughed, half-sobbed, and nodded before she could speak. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." Lucas whooped, raising his half-eaten cupcake like a trophy. They pulled him into a hug, the 3 of them tangled in arms and laughter, the ring still clutched between Laura's fingers. Around them, life went on. Bicycles sped past, a dog barked, kids screamed from the playground. But under that tree, nothing else existed. Just a boy who once had no one, a woman who had lost everything but never her grace, and a man who finally knew what it meant to be found. They stayed there long after the sun dipped low, their laughter mixing with the breeze, their story stitched quietly into the rhythm of a city that never stopped moving. And from that day on, they never had to eat soup alone again. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, if it reminded you that family is not always about blood, and that sometimes love arrives when we least expect it, in the simplest of ways, then you're exactly where you belong. We bring you real, heartfelt tales of resilience, second chances, and the quiet miracles that live within everyday life. Stories that remind us how powerful one small act of kindness can be, how healing love can look like a bowl of soup, and how a child's innocent question can change the course of a life. If you believe in stories that heal, stories that matter, stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe to our channel. Join our growing family, where hearts connect Tears are welcome, and every story brings us closer to the best parts of being human. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. This was Soul-Stirring Stories, and remember, sometimes all it takes is one small voice saying, "Can you be my friend?" to open the door to a whole new life.